We lived together for nearly 40 years and never had a single argument. And that is exactly why my marriage died. On September 14, 1983, I stood in a small church on the outskirts of Ohio, wearing a rented suit that didn't quite fit my shoulders, holding my wife Margaret's hand, and stepping into a marriage that would later last almost 40 years in which we never once had a real argument. This morning, sitting alone on the front porch of this old wooden house right where Margaret used to sit every morning to slip on her shoes before going to work, I finally realized that this was not something to be proud of. I rested my hands on my knees, looked down at the pair of leather shoes worn thin at the heels. Shoes I've worn for years, and waited for the coffee maker to finish dripping, an old habit Margaret used to remind me not to leave sitting too long. Everything about that morning felt familiar, so familiar I could move through it without thinking, just like the way we lived together for all those years. I used to believe that a good marriage was a quiet one, no raised voices, no arguments, no hurt feelings. That belief stayed with me from our wedding day in 1983 all the way through the final years we lived under the same roof. Margaret and I lived side by side for a very long time, long enough to know each other's routines, long enough to avoid whatever might cause discomfort, and long enough for certain sentences to stop in my head, never making it out loud. It wasn't until I found myself sitting here on an entirely ordinary morning that I began to understand something. Some things don't disappear because of a single dramatic event. They don't vanish overnight. They leave no clear warning signs that tell you to stop and pay attention. They simply retreat slowly, steadily, until you grow used to not calling them by name anymore. That was when I finally allowed myself to say my age out loud. I am 72 years old, and sitting on that familiar porch, I began to wonder not about the day we got married, but about a morning very much like this one, when something between us had quietly disappeared without either of us noticing. It took me nearly 40 years to realize that a marriage can fade away without a single argument. Not in one dramatic moment, but through countless small ones when something felt hard to say and I chose silence, when something felt uncomfortable and I told myself it wasn't worth making a big deal out of, when a real conversation was postponed because keeping the peace felt easier. Like many people, I once believed that avoiding conflict was how you protected love. And for a long time it seemed to work. There was no shouting, no tension, no one walked out. But slowly we began talking only about safe topics, steering clear of questions that might reveal differences, and growing accustomed to never touching each other's real thoughts. The consequences of that choice didn't arrive all at once. They accumulated over the years until one day I realized I was standing inside a relationship I no longer knew how to begin again. Not because everything was badly broken, but because it had been so long since either of us dared to look directly at what was missing. Sitting alone with myself, I started asking when that silence had first begun and how many years I had called it fine simply because it caused no trouble. From the outside, my life looked perfectly fine. I worked as a maintenance engineer at a parts manufacturing plant in Toledo for nearly 30 years, a job so predictable I could anticipate every shift. Margaret and I lived in a one-story wooden house in a quiet suburb with a white fence and a lawn I mowed every Saturday morning. Our evenings almost never changed: dinner at 6:30, local news at 7, lights out by 9. We took one vacation a year, usually to the same beach in South Carolina, took a few photos that looked exactly like the ones from previous years, and then came home. I never neglected my responsibilities, never came home drunk late at night, never disappeared on my family, and that's why people assumed we were doing just fine. But during all those years, there were things I didn't do. I never asked Margaret why she stopped telling me about her work at the library. I never said out loud how uneasy I felt when our conversations shrank to bills, meals, and doctor's appointments. I didn't stop myself when I noticed I was lingering in the garage longer than necessary just to avoid sitting together in the quiet living room. I told myself it was just exhaustion after work, or age, or the natural shape of life after many years together. I told myself not everything needed to be discussed, that keeping things orderly and calm mattered more than stirring up feelings that might complicate our days. And slowly I became accustomed to letting difficult things pass without ever making a decision about them. Looking back now, I see that our marriage looked fine for a very long time. Fine enough that no one questioned it. Fine enough that even I failed to notice the distance growing between two people living under the same roof. Only now, sitting alone and replaying those familiar evenings, do I begin to wonder when that distance first appeared and how I learned to live with it without ever realizing what it was. There was no single day when I consciously decided to avoid an important conversation. It started more quietly than that. Sometime in the mid-1990s, I developed the habit of telling myself it could wait. When Margaret sighed in the kitchen after a long day at the library and said nothing more, I assumed it was just fatigue, that the weekend would be soon enough to talk. By the time I was in my 40s, our evenings still happened on schedule in the same places, but with fewer words than before. Again, I told myself it was just a phase. By the early 2000s, as the children grew up and the house became quieter, silence showed up more often, and I grew used to calling it by harmless names. After I was promoted at the factory in 2005, I started coming home later, eating dinner alone more often, and telling myself that once things settled down, I would make it up to her. Then it became after we finished paying off the mortgage in 2010, after retirement, after the next summer vacation. The word after was always there, reasonable enough that it never forced me to stop. I didn't postpone one big thing. I postponed hundreds of small ones, small enough not to draw attention, small enough not to seem like a problem. We kept living on schedule, on time, in our assigned roles, and I confused maintaining a routine with maintaining closeness. Time moved forward steadily without needing my permission. When I entered my 60s, I realized there wasn't much left for us to talk about, but I still comforted myself with the idea that this was just what happens when people live together for a long time. It wasn't until I finally sat alone with myself, looking back over the years, that I began to wonder how many times I had said later, and in which of those moments I had missed the last real chance to say what needed to be said. I remember the evening of October 17, 2018 very clearly. It was an ordinary weekday night, and that was precisely why I wasn't prepared for what happened. After dinner, Margaret stood at the sink washing dishes, and I sat at the kitchen table reading the local paper in the same spots we had occupied for years. There was no tension, no anger, no sign that this would become a moment I'd remember. She washed for a while, then turned to me and asked in the same calm tone someone might use to ask about the weather, "Do you remember the last time we had an argument?" I looked up, thought for a few seconds, then smiled lightly and joked, "Maybe that's why people still think our marriage is fine." Margaret didn't smile. She nodded, went back to washing the dishes, and then added very softly, almost more to herself than to me, "I don't remember the last time you really told me what you were thinking." There was no exclamation point, no accusation, just a sentence set down in the middle of the kitchen and carried away by the sound of running water. I didn't know how to respond, so I chose what had become most familiar: silence. I lowered my eyes back to the newspaper, turned the page, and pretended that what she had said didn't require an answer right then. But in that brief moment, I knew I had missed something important, that a small door had opened and then closed again. And I wasn't sure how many chances I would get for it to open a second time. It wasn't until late 2020 that I began to see what had really happened when the house in Toledo was left with only one person living in it: me. Margaret moved out that March on a cold morning, taking 2 suitcases and a box of personal documents. She said she needed space to breathe. I stood in the garage doorway, nodded like an understanding man, and told her she should go, that we could talk again when she was ready. I said it gently, automatically, the same way I had said similar things before. In my mind, this was still just a pause, a temporary separation before coming back together. I still believed we had time, but the days that followed passed faster and emptier than I expected. No one asked if I'd eaten dinner. No one reminded me to turn on the porch light when it got dark. There were no familiar footsteps in the house anymore, just rooms lit up with no one passing through them. I began to notice very small details I had never thought of as missing before. Some evenings I picked up my phone thinking about calling Margaret to finally say the things I had held back for years. But I didn't know how to begin. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because we had lived in silence for so long that honest words no longer had a familiar place to land. Only when I was alone in that house did I gradually understand that our marriage hadn't ended with a single major decision. It ended quietly at a point when there was no longer enough left to hold on to, and no longer enough words to begin again. And in that long stretch of quiet, I started to wonder how many times before, when everything was still intact, I had stood in front of a door just like this one and chosen to turn away. The most dangerous thing I ever believed wasn't a lie, but the idea that as long as I don't do anything wrong, that's enough. I lived by that belief for too long, and its consequences didn't come as arguments or obvious cracks, but as a marriage that was still standing and already hollow inside. I chose being right over being close, stability over honesty, and I took pride in being the one who kept everything from falling apart. But when Margaret left, I realized that not doing anything wrong hadn't helped me hold on to anything at all. I kept life running, but let its meaning slip away without noticing. I thought responsibility and stability were the strongest foundations there were, until I stood alone in that house and understood that what I had lacked wasn't effort, but real presence. And when I began to look back at my life through that lens, I realized the most painful question was no longer why this marriage ended, but how many other parts of my life had collapsed in the exact same silent way. I don't get a chance to start over. That's a truth I live with every day. I've reached the end of this road and learned that some doors only open when you're still willing to walk through them. They don't reopen just because you've regretted things long enough. I no longer have time to try to say what should have been said many years ago, and there's no one left to hear it. But you are standing somewhere else. You still have time, still have evenings not completely filled by routine, still have words that haven't yet been swallowed out of fear of disturbing the calm. I'm not saying this to tell you what to do, only to place in your hands a question I ignored for far too long, if not now. When do you plan to let that important thing wait until? There is one very specific question I avoided for years, and even now it remains quiet but not gone. Is there something important in my life that I am not saying simply because I'm afraid of disrupting the peace? I asked that question too late, when my marriage was no longer there for anyone to face it with me. What I want to say to you isn't that you should do something dramatic, but that you should look directly at that question while it is still small, while it's only a vague discomfort, an unstarted conversation, a pause that hasn't yet turned into distance. I don't know what shape that question takes in your life, but if you're telling yourself it can wait, that there's no need to rush, then that may be exactly when it needs to be heard the most. I'm not here to give advice, only to say what I learned too late. There are questions which, if not asked in time, will leave no one behind to answer them with you.